Good evening, guys. Tomorrow we're going to start the new story. The name of the story is The Book of the Dead. The story is written by an author called Edwidge Danticat. And before we start talking about the story, we're going to talk about Edwidge first. Now, Edwidge came from an island called Haiti, and over there she grew up in a city called Port-au-Prince, which is a large port in the city, in the capital of Haiti. When she was young, her parents left their home for the United States, and she remained behind. She was taken care of by her aunt. And her uncle. Later on, she joined her parents in Brooklyn, in New York, when she was 12. She loved her culture very much. She only spoke Haitian Creole, and Haitian Creole is a kind of language that they use in Haiti that descended from French. By time she started to learn how to speak French, and she started to learn how to speak English, and she loved writing very much. At a very young age, she became a rising star in American fiction. Some of her first novels were Breathe and Eyes Memory, and people loved her very much. And they loved her fiction writing. Now, before we start, I'm also going to start talking about the book, because tomorrow we're going to study the vocabulary for the book. So, first of all, before we start, there are a few questions that I'd like to ask you. What kind of secrets might you keep from a child if you were a parent? What kind of secret don't you want your children to know? And what kind of facts about parents' past are important for a child to know? So what should be kept from a child as a parent? And what shouldn't be kept from a child by a parent? And of course, before we start talking about the vocabulary, I'd just like to introduce a quick background that is very important before we read the story. Now, this story takes place in contemporary times. Contemporary times means in advanced times, not in the past. But it also refers to dark days in the history of Haiti, from 1957 to 1971. So we're talking about the past, and at the same time we're talking about the present. We're talking about both together. And yes, it was dark times in the country because the country was ruled by a brutal dictator. His name was Francois, or otherwise known as Papa Doc. Now, during his time, he employed thugs, he employed muscle, he gave them money, and basically those thugs were the people that did his dirty work. And during this time, the thugs employed by his government, they terrorized citizens. They arrested, tortured, and beat Duvalier's opponents. Anybody who was against Papa Doc, the dictator, anybody who was against him was arrested, tortured, or beaten. Most of his casualties were illiterates, people that couldn't read and write, poor people, and desperate people. Many of these torturers and murderers did their jobs just to feed their families. So, yes, the thugs that Papa Doc hired, all of those thugs, they needed money to just take care of their families, to give their families food. Now, the title of the story comes from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is a collection of texts related to funeral ceremonies of ancient Egypt. Now, these texts were considered important for helping the dead undergo trials or tests before reaching happiness in the afterlife. So again, The name of the book is taken from the Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The similarity between the Egyptian Book of the Dead and the Book of the Dead, the story that we are going to read, is that both talk about dead people. Both talk about how dead people are trying to go through tests to reach happiness in their afterlife. So, this was the first part, which was the background. It was dark days in the history of Haiti from 1957 to 1971, when Haiti was ruled by a dictator called Francois Duvalier, or he was also named or known as Papa Doc. Okay, and Papa Doc employed thugs that killed, tortured, and beat anybody that opposed Papa Doc. So, now we have some words that I'd like to introduce, very important vocabulary. Number one, we're going to start with the first word, which is interject. It's a verb. It means to cut into with a comment. For example, Lily likes to interject her own comments into other people's conversations. So to cut into with a comment, so when someone is talking, you can stop them while talking by saying a comment of your own. So you can comment about what someone is commenting about. So when someone is talking, you can give a comment. When you give a comment, you interject. Mesmerize, the next word. It's also a verb. It means to hypnotize. To hypnotize someone is to try to put someone under a spell, to try to control someone's actions by using magic. Example, Diego was so mesmerized by the flow of water over the falls that he could not leave. Vulnerability. The next word, and it is a noun. It is a state of being open to harm or damage. So vulnerability is basically weakness. It means weakness. You can easily get hit, you can easily get damaged, you can easily get sick. The next word, eradicate, to do away with completely, which means to, it could be used in many different ways. Eradicate, which is to kill. Eradicate, which means to destroy. Eradicate means to remove something completely. Next, the last word, which is testament. It's a noun. It is a proof or tribute to something. So a testament is like a proof. It is evidence. Now, in this story, we're going to talk about irony. And irony is a contrast between what is expected and what actually happens. Again, irony is the difference between what is expected and what actually happens. So for example, if we're talking about a story like Beauty and the Beast, we'd all expect the beauty, the princess, to marry the beast and turn him back into a human being. But it would be called irony if she was killed by the beast and no one ever heard of her again. So that irony is what you wouldn't expect. It is the opposite of what you would expect. So, in situational irony, the outcome of a situation is the opposite of a character's expectations. So if we're talking about a character in the story, the character is thinking of something, the character is expecting something, but the events that happen in the story happen opposite to the character's expectation. And we're also going to study dramatic irony. So when the reader has information that the characters do not have. So in this story, what's going to happen is that you're going to find yourself having information. At the same time, the character in the book does not have that information yet. So this was how Danticap, or Edwidge Danticap, uses irony in the story. Again, a really quick revision again on the vocabulary: interject, mesmerize, vulnerability, eradicate, and testament. Okay, and pretty much that's it. If you guys have any questions, please let me know in the class. Thank you so much.